Hello and welcome to the Business Central Training Place, the channel for all things BC, where you get to not only learn how one of the best ERP solutions on the market works in detail, but you also get to understand why you might want to use any of the specific features and how it applies to the real world. In this specific video, we will be continue our series talking about the jobs and resource management, and we'll focus on the jobs or projects in Business Central. Before I begin, I would like to remind you to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the next video, since, well, so far I'm managing to release at least 1 up to 2 videos a week, so I hope we'll keep up with this, so you don't want to miss the next one. So, speaking about jobs and resources, there's essentially several scenarios we can discuss when we are looking at the jobs module. Scenario number 1 would be where you have a project which essentially is pre-allocated. So you have a fixed price, a fixed scope, and you have your resources which are known already from the moment you sign the contract. Which means that if you do not expect any deviations, or if deviations don't change how you're going to be recording both expenses and revenue for the project, then you actually get the chance to pre-enter all the details on the project and then just track any unforeseen things that might happen on top of what's already on the contract. So potential changes, increase in scope, or whatever it is, or decreases as well. Now, scenario number 2 would be where you have a project which is more fluid. So you kind of know what's allocated, or maybe you don't even know it all. You just know the length and the total amount that you can spend and that you can invoice. And then you want to use the jobs module to actually track the ongoing progress, so both you and the customer can make sure that you don't go overboard. So in both scenarios, you basically start the same way. You will be going to the jobs list. So in my case, I have it as a shortcut because I am running the row the role of project manager. Of course, you can always go ahead and search for it. So in my case, I have the jobs opened, and I have an existing list of projects. Essentially, each line you have here represents a project you want to be tracking. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new project so we don't use the existing ones. The number series can be preset. And we're going to talk about the setups in a different video, so I want to focus on the process today. So the number series is automatic, but you can actually enter a manual number if it makes sense in your process. Then you can go ahead and enter a description of the project, basically how you recognize it. So let's say that's a really cool project 1. And you will have to select what's called a bill to customer number. That's basically the entity to whom you're going to be invoicing all of the expected revenue. So let's go ahead and select, let's say, the A-Datum Corporation. That's as good as any other. And as soon as you select the customer, all the contact details are populated. If you actually go ahead and click the Show More fields, you see there's also address information and several more fields, which are not necessarily too important most of the time. So what we are interested in, additionally to selecting the job number, description, and the bill to customer, which are essentially mandatory, are several additional fields, which are, you can treat them as optional, but I would recommend populating them because they would help you later in reporting. And also they actually give you important information. So first one is responsible person. That would essentially be the main person as a driving force of the project. So we do have a separate field for the project manager, as you can see down here. So that's a different person. They can actually be the same. So I have no problem in selecting, for example, Sami Nedelchev to be the responsible person, and I can select a user here which corresponds to the same user. The difference is that the responsible person is actually one of your resources. So that opens the pool of resources, and we discussed them in the different video. There will be a link in the description. But basically, this is the resource, and then the project manager is actually a user that logs into the database, which can be the same person, But the idea of the project manager is that he's the one responsible for approving and posting and actually monitoring the revenue and expenses on the project. Now, if you guys go back to and see the video for the timesheets management, which will be in the link, basically this is where we were discussing that in the resources setup, I actually need to learn spelling sometimes. So in the resources setup, we had an interesting setting which was called timesheet by job approval. And I'm actually going to explain the logic at a different stage. So this is one of the times when I'm going to mention it. Think of it this way. We have many different resources, which for the sake of example, let's say are people, and they can be reporting their time. So each of them we can assign to a, let's say, team leader or a directly responsible person for any given resource, who is what's called their timesheet approver. So that will be the person who is responsible to actually go and approve the time that has been reported by this person if we activate the timesheet functionality. However, the resources setup allows us to say, if we choose always, to essentially say, okay, the person who is reporting their time will have their time approved only in the cases where their time is not related to a project or a job. Whenever the time is reported on a job, the person who is set up as the job project manager is the only one who can approve their time, except if there is something called a timesheet administrator, which again we covered in the other video. So this is a very powerful setting which allows you to decide how time is actually accepted as expense for your company. So if you're using the jobs module and you want to and you have different project managers for different projects, and you don't want to centralize time approval to be a task done by the team leader, but is rather something done by the project manager, then you want to come over here and set up this setting to always. And of course, you have something like a middle ground where you say for people type of resources, they are approved by their team lead, but it's of a machine, then it's the respective project manager or job manager who's going to do the approval. So I'm going to leave it at, for me, it doesn't matter because I'm the only user here, and essentially both options will work the same for me. But yeah, this is something you should know can be changed. So this is where the project manager role can be very important. Going down, I'm going to minimize the general tab. We'll come back to the job tasks in a second. The most important thing after creating the job number and the description is going to the posting tab and setting your job posting group. Now we will talk about it in a further video detailing the finance and the accounting link to the jobs module. But in short, just so you know why this is important, this is basically where we set up the various GL accounts which will be used by the system posting all the transactions we do. So this is a very important step. And again, we'll actually link back to these fields when we're talking about the finance aspects of closing the projects and recognizing revenue and so on and so forth. So for now, we can more or less skip this and we'll circle back to this in the next video. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize the posting tab. And the rest of the information is, I would say, optional, but I encourage you to actually use the field since it can be very useful in reporting. So the duration tab only has 3 fields. You have a starting date and an ending date for the project, or you basically select, you know, as you might expect, when does the project start and when it ends. So let's say anytime it's a 1-month project for the month of March. And the creation date is a system field that you don't control. It basically tells you when this card was created. Moving on to the foreign trade, you will only want to come over here in case that's a project that's happening abroad and you want to change the currency code in which you want to be invoicing the customer. So essentially, if your customer is set to be invoiced in something other than the local currency, empty means that's the local currency. So if it's anything other than the local currency, then you can change this here. And again, this will be populated based on the customer card you selected, but you can override this setting at this point. And then you can choose that this is the currency for the project, but you can choose what is the currency in which you want to actually invoice the customer later. So this will be, let's say, your expense currency code, and this will be more of in reporting for the project, and this will be the invoice that's generated by the system. And you have some options here which will circle again back to the reporting with finance, which will be a separate video. And the last tab again is something we're going to look at during that video, but basically there's some let's say, think of it as a dynamic report which shows you the progress of the project. Now, you do have some interesting fact boxes on the right-hand side where you basically have the overview of the job, how many resources were assigned, items, and geo accounts. So this will basically be details which are related to the various tasks that we'll cover in a second. And then you have basically some totals on the report on what's your budget cost by type of object of the budget, and then the actual and the billable and the invoice. So just a quick overview. So what I usually like to do is hide this section so I get a little bit more screen real estate. Also, if you're opening the jobs for the first time, you may have them like this. So it's a good idea to click so they expand and you get more screen real estate. And then let's get to the basically most interesting part of the project, and that's the task lines. And what they essentially represent is your project plan. And the way they're structured is you have to create a task number and a task description. And then for each task number, essentially, you will later get to report your actual usage and your actual your budget and your actual invoicing and what's billable. So think of it this way. You need at least one line here in the tasks, because this line is what you'll be using to invoice customer and against which you'll be recognizing expenses, timesheet reports, and all of that stuff. So again, if you go back to the timesheets video, link in the description, this is where you will see that I select the job task number and the job number as the objects of what I was working on. So they are the tasks that I work on. And you have a very interesting dynamic here in the job task type, which lets you create like a hierarchy. Think of this as a reporting tool. So in the same way as in something like a Microsoft project, for example, you'd have like a summarizing line on top, which is the total for the project, and then a sub-summary for each section, let's say each phase of the project, and then you have a breakdown of the actual activities. It's a similar thing here. So let's say we want to create a similar, I'll just create a two-stage project, so nothing too fancy. So it's important to know that the job task number is how the sorting is done. So you have to be, well, creative and careful. Just realize that if I say 1, and then 2 on the next line, and then I have 11, then as soon as I refresh, you see that the 11 is just below the 1, and then it will be 1, 11, and then 12, 13, 14, 15, and then you get the 20s and so on. So it's a much better idea to just put a couple of zeros. So let's say 0, 0, 1, and then of course I'll have to rename this, and then you have one less zero, so 0, 0, 11. And the idea is so you get the same number of digits on each line, and then the sorting will be just fine. So you have 0, 0, 0, 2. And if I then click F5 to refresh, you see that now they're ordered in the right way. You can, of course, also add characters here. So I could have just said project, for example. It's still because I like adding the numbers because they're the primary thing that it's gonna be sorted. If you just use letters, then of course you get the alphabetical sorting. So you may have to, be creative with the naming you're using. So what I want to do here is, what I would usually do is, you need so many symbols depending on how many layers you're gonna have. So I could have gone away with just 2, for example. But if I call this a project, then I'll say project header, for example. And I could just use the heading type, and that's if you just want to have a line which is just the title and it doesn't have anything to do with reporting. I usually ignore it, but it is an option. So heading basically is a line that doesn't do anything. It will not appear anywhere when you're posting transactions, but it will actually appear if you're looking then at the report on a task level. So feel free to use that. I personally ignore it. What I am going to do is select the begin total. And then what I'm going to do next is say I'm going to do a 9999 and then underscore project. So what this gives me is essentially sorry, like a sandwich layer where I have the 0001 project and 9999 project, and anything which is in between essentially are subtasks. So I have the project total here, for example, and this I'm going to call an end total. And this is going to be really nice because then I can start creating my, let's say, sub layers. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say 0002 is going to be phase 1 of the project. And depending on whether you want to have phase 1 have its subtasks and activities, then this could also be a begin total. And then I'm going to create and say that 0002, and that would be, I don't know, activity 1. So that will be, for example, in phase 1. I could put the description here, it doesn't matter. And again, if you roll back to the timesheet reporting, this description will actually appear in your timesheet reporting. So it might actually make sense to add some text which tells you, if I just put activity 1 and then I have phase 2 and then again I have activity 1 in phase 2, and in timesheet it won't be obvious what exactly I'm reporting on. So this can actually be a posting type. So the important thing to know is that the posting type of tasks is the ones against which you will actually be reporting times, expenses, and revenue. So these are really important. And I'll just put activity number 2. So I use F8, just change the number to 2, and we're gonna start moving a little bit faster now. And this is also posting, and then I'm gonna go ahead and say 0002 phase end, for example. I like adding underscores just in case, and maybe I should have put phase begin, for example. Now you have to be careful because in my case begin and end alphabetically should be sorted in the correct order, but you know, you have to be careful with the wording, and you'll see in a second why. So once I press F5, this is actually going to resort. So I have see, just because I put this beginning end and there's just letters here, this actually spoils this thing. So it might actually make sense to have just I don't know, 000 here. No, actually that's not a good idea. So that's my first activity, so it will be 001, for example, and again you can play with the letters later. And then this will be 002, and then phase begin would actually be just the 000. So you see how just the simple numbering actually changes where things are. So this one I can leave it like this, but if I want to make sure this is really at the end, I'll just put the 9s here. And again, you can actually do it with numbers, characters as well, so that's not a problem. You just have to be careful which characters you actually use. So this will be phase 1 and, for example, and I'll basically just do the same for phase 2. So 0003, this will be 000, and I'll rename this, and then we have phase 1, phase 2, sorry, and then you get the begin total, and then you get 0002 001, that should be 3. Of course I'm not paying attention. That would be, and see what I meant, it actually makes sense to have here 2, so you can distinguish them if you're looking at them in a different area of the system. And this would be activity 2, and let's put the total. And the reason I'm putting 9s as a total, this gives me the chance, if at a later stage I have to add an extra activity, then it's very easy. Basically I have 1000 activities to add, and activity 1 and activity 2 means I mean these are just one after the other, so maybe it would have been better to put them 10 and 12, or maybe even 100 and 200, and then this gives me the chance to later make this as a master activity and have sub activities below. So of course it's best to plan ahead, but yeah, just these are some things that can be done. As you can see, as I was doing it right now, you can actually without any problem renumber and rename these, so that's okay. It's whatever you're doing here is never fully final. There is one exception. If you actually create this as a posting type and then you change your mind and decide to make it a begin and for example, this, you will be in trouble because you cannot have transaction registered against an end total. So yeah, you have to be careful with at least plan your groups ahead. But then of course you could just, if you had this and you wanted to make this like a master activity, then you can create another code which is the activity and remember this as the first activity in the new group. So there's any number of tricks you can play here to make it work. There is one thing you can do in the end. Let me see, and you have a functions here, so you may have to actually click more options, click line, and under functions you have this really cool feature which I love. It actually doesn't do too much, except it will actually do the indentation. It will also make sure that for each begin total, you have an end total, and for each end total there is a corresponding begin total. So it will actually do the check for you if you messed something, but it also visually indents the text, so now it's nice and pretty and very easy to understand what we're doing. So you saw it takes what, less than 5 minutes to do that, and there is no actual limit to how many lines you can create here. So you know, the sky's the limit. Again, always think about this, that this as a report. So think of this as being the lines opposite which you actually get to see values in the future. So structure it in a way that makes sense from a reporting perspective. And again, don't be too scared of messing up, as you saw me do it several times in the video. It's really easy to fix. Granted, if there's thousands of entries posted, this renaming function could take a little bit while longer, but it's generally pretty fast. So we have our project plan, essentially structure created. And again, the lines which are with the type of posting are the ones which we are really interested in, because these are the lines where we later get to actually report time and report expenses and report revenue. So for each of these lines, essentially how it works is for phase 1 activity 1 and for phase 1 activity 2, you will get to record, if you want to track your budget, and you'll see why this is called a total in a few minutes. Then you will see what your actuals versus budget, and having the budget beforehand is a little bit of an option, but yeah, generally you will see this. The actuals will be based on the real postings in the system, so this will be the actual total cost, which comes from registering purchase expenses, essentially. And then you have the billable total, because some of the budgeted amounts might be subject to being billed to the customer, but some maybe not. And essentially you compare the billable to the actual invoice. So think of these columns as couples. So billable versus budget cost versus actual cost, and then budget cost versus actual cost, and then billable price or potential revenue versus actually invoiced revenue. And all of these will be done on these lines, the posting type lines, but the end total on each line will be the summary of the 2 lines above it. So this is really handy. And the grand total, the last end total, will be the sum of all the columns. And don't worry, the end totals of the subgroups will not be added twice, so you won't get a duplicated amount at the end total level. So how do we actually get values here? So how do we actually report time? Well, this is where the 2 scenarios I mentioned in the beginning come into play. So if we were to say we're in scenario 1, where we have a pre-allocated budget, so our project manager already knows what they're supposed to be doing and when it's supposed to happen and who is going to do the job and how much the work is going to be, pretty much exactly. They can actually go ahead and create these lines before that. So the values for each of these columns come from different entries, and we are interested first in creating the budget. So if I go ahead and check the phase 1 activity 1 budget total cost, I can just click on this dash. It's dash because there is no value there, and it's going to take me to something called job planning lines. Alternatively, I can just select this line. You know that it's selected by having the arrow here, then click line, then job, and then click here. But whether I do this and it opens on a new screen, or which is called job planning lines, or I just select the line and click on job budget total cost, it takes me to the same place. The only difference is that now this is in edit mode. And basically I have to click edit list before I can change anything, but that's the major difference. So when I'm here, the lines that I create, and I'm going to go ahead and expand this again, the sum of these lines are what's going to show as my budgeted cost, and actually the billable cost, billable revenue as well. So how do you create these lines? Well, you have the job task number, so you know which task you're working with. So again, having a meaningful number code here will be helpful. You can always click to see what's the description, but the description is not shown by default, and unless your partner actually customizes the system with the developer's help, there is no easy way to actually bring in the description here, at least not without going into the development topic. So code can be important. The first thing you select for each line is, what is it going to represent? Is this going to be part of only the budget? Essentially, is this just a cost for you that you're not going to essentially forward to your customer? Or is it something which is pure revenue? So purely a billable line, it possibly doesn't have much to do with the cost. Or if it's budget and billable. So when I say it has to do with the cost or it doesn't have to do, that's a little bit misleading, because no matter which of these options you choose, you can always populate the columns for cost and unit price. So they will be calculated in the project, but essentially only the lines which are selected with billable or budget and billable will be suggested when you're later generating the invoices, and those will probably be in a later video. So this is really important which one you choose. If you choose a budget line, then basically you're saying this line should not be generated, it should not go to a customer, it should not be suggested as an invoiceable line. So you have to be careful with which one you choose. The good news is you can potentially change this. There are some limitations when you can change it, but you can. There's still some time to change it after you create the line for the first time. Now, so one of the easiest thing is, again, I have my project plan, which was probably created in a different tool. Could be here as well, but yeah, let's say it was created in a different tool or just forwarded to me as a project manager. I can just come over here and start entering these lines. So let's say everything's going to be both budget and billable. So I'm going to treat it as my budgetable cost, which I'm going to track against the actual expenses, and then this should also be possibly forwardable to the customer. And then I have the planned delivery date, which is basically when do I plan to finish this specific resource delivery. And it can be a resource, or it could be an item that you're planning to ship to a customer, or this could be a GL account. I'm going to skip the text section because it's a little bit special, but you do have also the option to just enter a line with some text. And then you could potentially put some cost there, but generally assume there's just the three options. Most of the time, that's what you're going to do. So if it's a resource, then when are we planning to deliver this? So think of this as the end date of the activity. There isn't an actual starting date. So let's say this was a project in March. So we're going to do this by the 12th of March. And I can skip the document number. You can use it. It could be helpful later when we talk about posting, but for now I can ignore it. And then of course you get the choice. So what is the vehicle that's carrying this, both budget and billable? That means an expense and a revenue. So it could be a resource. That means generally an employee of the company, or it could be a machine, depending on how you structure things. Could also be an item. So then we're usually talking about some kind of tangible asset that you're going to transfer. And although there is this concept of a service item, so it's not really a physical thing. So in the newer versions, it's getting a little bit murky, but just let's assume for the sake of the example now that we're talking about something that we're going to track as an inventory item. And then you have the option as GL account, basically just use the chart of accounts as your vehicle of the expenses. So I would encourage you to use the first two as much as possible because they just give you the extra layer of using all the reports related to the resources and the item modules and the inventory modules in the system. Whereas if you only use the geo accounts, which you're welcome to do, it will limit the amount of reporting you get out of the box based on that. So if you're planning to use a BI tool, that could be just fine, maybe. But yeah, generally speaking, if there's going to be resources and as in employees or machines, I would highly recommend using the resource management module, and then items as in, I don't know, whether it's inventoriable or no inventoriable, doesn't matter. So to make it simple for now, let's just stick to the resources. And then I'm going to choose, let's say Sami, even though I'm technically the project manager as well, but I'm gonna go ahead and use myself. That's because I want to tie it into the timesheets reporting again. And then now, depending on how you set this up, I could have already gotten some costs and prices populated here. So we're going to circle back to this when we're talking about the financial aspect of things. And I'm going to show you, I might actually show it later, but we'll see how long this video gets. But basically you can have predefined costs and prices which get populated as soon as you select the resource, and this will actually require you to use the personalization option and bring in an extra field, which is for some reason hidden by default. It should be called work type code. So I very much encourage you guys to use this. It essentially gives you a whole layer of flexibility on how to set this up. And basically think of these work type codes as a way to distinguish what types of work can the same resource perform. So there's several ways to think of this. I'm going to create just a few examples so you have an idea. So you have regular work. We managed to spell it correctly. So think of this as just the usual service that you're providing for this guy. So then you have to actually select what's the unit of measure that you're going to use for this time reporting. And you may have to actually be careful because there is a setup on the resources card where you choose whether this resource is working per hours or per days as a unit of measure. So if you choose here hours, but they're actually set up as days, then you may get an error message when you're selecting this type of work. So in order to solve this, there is an extra setting, which I'll show you in a second on the resource card to show what's the conversion factor between an hour and a day, for example, or whatever other unit of measure you may choose to use. So, but you will need to choose this for each type of work. And just know that these types of works are then available for all the resources. So one option will be, say, regular, and then you have after hours or extra hours, or however you may want to term it. So usually the practices you would like if this is price 1 unit, then this would usually be like 1.5 units or whatever is the case. And then national holidays. Maybe I should have said work during national holidays. Yeah. And let's say per hour again, and that would typically be something like twice or triple the usual rate. Like if essentially the customer is forcing you to work at a time where you should not be asking your employees to work, then you normally have to recompense them at a higher rate. Again, this is purely up to however the company arranges their work with the resources. So this is essentially one layer of how you can treat the work code to distinguish your different aspects, which can reflect the change on your cost and also on the price you may charge the customer. It is also possible to use this as a way to say that the same resource can perform different roles within the organization. So let's say this resource, Sami, he can be a regular consultant, and consultant role, and then we build that per hours, and then maybe he can also be a PM, right? So it's the same resource, but depending on what role they play in the different projects, which happens with me often. So sometimes I'm just an assistant consultant and there is another project manager or solution architect, whatever the case. Then, of course, I might be billed at a different rate, potentially, depending on how the project is agreed. And then if I play the role of a project manager, that's different, and a solution architect, it's different. So again, this has more to do with your costing and the revenue that you can set up. But of course, it also has to do with reporting. Like I might be interested to know how much of this person's time is spent playing all of these roles. And of course, if you're going to do these, then you probably want to have them as combinations with the structure or with the options above. So I mean, you shouldn't have to choose between whether he's a consultant or he's working regular hours. So you'd normally create something like consultant R, and you probably have to do it consult R. So that would be consultant role regular hours, and then you would essentially insert a new line here. Let's say, okay, just go here and say consult, and that will be a consultant after hours. And you're starting to get the idea, right? So basically then this would be H. And then of course I get basically all the combinations. Now, how exactly you're going to use it, it's completely up to you. Just know that these are some of the more common ways how the work types are being used. So let's say I'll choose the consultant after hours, consultant regular hours. And I could have actually set that choosing the work type directly brings in those unit costs and unit prices that I mentioned. Now, even if that was the case, I can actually override those because, as you know, each project can have, its own negotiation. So it's a trade deal. So whatever the usual rates are, maybe we negotiated something special with the customer and with the employees. So basically, I can just put whatever cost. Let's say this is per hour. So maybe, okay, let's say, no, I actually wanted to have 40. In this case, pounds, I think, because this is a UK company, and my price could be something like 200, let's say. And then basically I'm specifying how many hours this guy's going to work. There is another column which is hidden, which again, it's probably a good idea to bring in, and that's the unit of measure code. So you actually have an idea of, what is the measurement in which we're doing this. So of course, because I chose the unit of measure in relation to the work type code, then this could be overwritten depending on which code you choose here. And you can, of course, change it. So you have an option, which is a selection related to the specific resource. So you need to actually predefine the available units of measure. And this is what I mentioned earlier. So this is usually done on the resource card. You can edit it here. So if one of the work types that I'm choosing was actually in days, for example, then you would need to populate this for that specific resource. So it's per resource. It's not a global setup for the whole company. And you have to say essentially how many hours are in a day. So if it's a 6-hour day, then you put a 6 here. If it's a 7.5 or 8 or whatever the case, you have to change it. But this is a setting at the resource. So actually there isn't an easy way to say, well, it's not hard either, but if you want to have some cases where it's a 6-hour day, then it would actually make sense to have different variations of this unit of measure. So you would say day 6, so 6-hour day, and then you would actually create another one which would be day 8, for example, so 8-hour day. And then this gives you some flexibility to choose, okay, so which one am I choosing now? So let's say this is day 6, and obviously I just duplicated the options from the line above. Sorry, guys. And this is day 8, so this will be 8 hours per day. And now I'm all set up in whatever is the case, whatever work type I want to choose, or however I want to do the reporting in the project. So I can actually just override these. Now, the combination of these two actually just gives me a way to look at a predefined list of prices and costs, which is something you can choose to use, or as I said earlier, you can just enter them manually depending on what's easier. And let's say I'm planning this guy to deliver 20 hours of work by that date here. As I mentioned, the starting date is not necessarily mentioned at this stage. And in case you're wondering, is the planning date the starting date? If I actually change this to the 8, it's going to overwrite it. And if I change this one to the 12th, it's going to overwrite it. So if you ask me why the hell is there not a starting and an ending date, then I actually don't have a good answer for this. So if one of you actually knows why this was done this way, feel free to just message me in the comments. I would love to see where I'm getting this wrong. So far, my solution for that is if you really want a starting date, then just, you have to customize a custom field, because I don't see one that I can use out of the box. So anyway, it's not the end of the world. It still works just fine. So what we did was we said that we are planning, so budgeting, but this is also going to be billable for the customer, that by the 12th of March, the resource called Sami Nedelchev is going to perform regular consulting work per hour for the amount of 20 hours, and we input some default cost and price. So let me just go ahead and enter a second line and say that the same guy is going to also do some extra work by the end of the week. So I can actually do that week per week, or you can just do it by the end of the month. It doesn't matter. And let's say it's the same, or you know what? Let's change it up a bit. So let's say he's gonna work also as a project manager a bit. So that's gonna be only 3 hours at, let's say, same cost, because he doesn't get paid more, but maybe the unit price for the customer changes. So that's 250, for example. If it sounds familiar to some of you, maybe it is. Anyway, so we we get different the same resource entering to do planning to do different types of work, potentially different dates, and then you have some quantity and the price and cost. So how this plays out is actually, if we go back to the tasks in the project, and if we hit F5, you will see that now we have a starting date and an ending date. So my starting date is the delivery date on the first activity and job planning line that I had, and the ending date for this phase currently is the delivery date of the last planning line that I have. So this is kind of how it's interpreting is, but you don't have a starting and ending date per planning line itself. So you're planning starting and ending for the activity itself. And if you didn't have two lines, then your starting and ending date would then be the same essentially. So it's again, it's a little bit weird. I'm missing something in the logic, but we'll figure it out someday. What you also see here is the two columns: billable total price and budget total cost were calculated. And of course, these are the sum of the respective columns, total cost and line amount for each of these lines. And we also got the phase one end total is also updated with the same amounts right now, because there is nothing planned for phase one activity two. And also our project total is updated as well for the same reason. So if I was to quickly go on line two, on activity two, and just create just one line so we don't take too much time, and say we're gonna have a budget and billable by, doesn't matter too much. So let's say same resource, and it doesn't matter, but let's say regular hours for 25 hours at, let's say, the same cost, so we don't change it too much, and we use the same thing. So I'll show you in a second, I think it makes sense in this clip, how these can actually be populated automatically. And if we go back and hit F5 again, or of course, if you just close the project card and you come back, this is basically the same thing as clicking F5. This refreshes every time. So now I have my planning budget for the second activity, billable as well, and now these are the total of these two lines. So it's pretty straightforward. Once you know which columns you need to populate, it's essentially about creating this structure here, and then for each of these lines, then listing all the activities which you want to be performing. So whether they are done by a resource or whether they are items that you want to add. And it doesn't matter what's the type here, the calculations here will always be the sum of everything. And just so you see how the options work, so if I change, let's do it for this line. So if I changed on the second line and say, no, this is actually the project manager, this is only going to be billable, it's for some weird reason, it's not considered cost. Then if we go back and I click F5, actually I think it already calculated, you see how my budget cost dropped down because it's no longer including the cost of the second line. I did click on the wrong line again. Yeah, actually, sorry, it is filtering it out. So there is a filter to only show the lines which are both or they include budget. But if I click line job job planning lines, then you see I get both lines, and I actually do have cost for 920. I just chose to not include this line as something that I'll plan as the cost of the project. I don't have a great example why I might want to do. I mean, okay, I do have. I mean, I would expect that if I'm selecting the option billable here, generally speaking, I would expect to not have a cost. But maybe you just don't want to show it in the report and you don't want to delete these columns. But generally, it doesn't make sense to have a defined cost for something that you consider purely billable, because I'll expect this is like just I don't know, just invoicing a service that somehow happens by default and you have no cost for that. It could be a strange scenario. And the same thing, if I say this is only budget, then now my budget is the total, but then I get excluded from here. If I click, I actually get excluded that second line, because I just said that's considered only expense and that's not going to be presumably invoiced to the customer. So that's how these two options play, and you know, have fun with them. I would expect most of the time you'll be choosing budget and billable, or maybe some cases just the budget if you have an expense you don't want to forward to the customer. So this is essentially how you create the basic structure of the project. You define the project itself, you assign who is the billable customer, you select the responsible person, then the project manager, who is going to be very important at later stages. Don't forget the posting group. It's going to be important the first time you want to press posting. And then essentially you build your project structure. So this is your project plan. As I mentioned, you need at least one line like this one, which is of posting type. If you do that, that's okay. You just don't get this nice hierarchy against which you get reporting, but it's perfectly fine. The functionality will work. So you create as many lines here depending on how detailed you want your reporting to be later. And again, I don't think there's an actual limit. There used to be like 50 sub-levels you can create. I haven't actually had a chance to test them because, that's a monster of a plan. But yeah, feel free to try it out for me. And yeah, this is basically just creating the basic structure. Now, I did promise I was after going to show you how you can get the costs and the prices to appear automatically. It's not going to take too long. So for this, we'll need to go to the resources card, and under, I think you can even do it from here directly from the list. You have under prices and resources, you have costs and prices. Surprise, surprise. So think of them as your price lists for prices and price list for costs. And this is where I mentioned last time in the timesheets management, where we created a fresh resource. I mentioned that the group resources can be really helpful. This is where it comes into play, because then you can define prices, essentially sales prices per resource or per group of resources. So like a team, for example, or a class of resource, or you can just say that's my basic price for everyone. So depending on the option you choose here, in my case, I open this from the resource card, so this is pre-selected. Then you can choose the work type code. So let's say the regular consultant role, you can choose different prices in different currencies, but let's say the unit price is 200. And then we can choose the same resource, and then you will have, let's say, consultant during the after hours. So this will be 250, and hopefully you guys know about this small trick. Then I'll multiply this by 1.5, so you can actually use Business Central as a quick calculator. Let's say the holidays will be the 200 multiplied by 2, for example. So this gives you a differentiating price list. And you can, of course, just not select and leave the work code empty. That's perfectly okay. But yeah, I would highly recommend doing that. Something else which is not here by default, and I'm not 100% sure why they've done it, is here in this view, you don't get to choose the unit of measure. But don't get discouraged. There's actually a new functionality that was just rolled out, I think with the last version, or maybe could be 17.3, where you actually get to play with something called price lists. So I'm going to actually show this in a different video, but there you get to choose a price per project and per time unit of measure and so on and so forth. So it's pretty flexible and it's pretty cool. But it's essentially the same idea, just gives you more layers of setup. And of course, if we just quickly go to the costs, it's the same concept. So you have the resource groups, all code, work type. You get to choose these options. What's the cost type? Essentially, if it's a fixed, or you can get a percentage extra on top. And then you can, yeah, basically just have what's the basis. So you have two fields, direct unit cost and unit cost. Unit cost is the one you're interested in. And let's just say, I think I was putting 40. So if I just preset it here, you can do that on the resource card directly, but that would assume that it's always the same. And here, using the work type codes, you can actually say that's my regular expense. And then if it's after hours, where is it? There you go. Then it's 40 by 1.5 and so on and so forth. So I won't do all of the scenarios. So if you go ahead and preset these, then essentially how it works is, if you enter a new line, it doesn't matter what's here, you choose the same resource. As soon as you choose the resource, if there was a price and or a cost which is defined for the empty work type code, then you will already see the values here. But in my case, because I chose all of the presets to be depending on the type of work code, so if I choose a regular, then you get the same price and cost. And if I go ahead and choose the during national holidays, I should get empty cost. And I thought I set a sales price, so maybe I just chose the wrong one. Oh, sorry, it was consultant holidays. Yeah, that's better. And then if you choose the consultant, which is after hours, then you get both increased cost and the revenue. And then it's just about entering how many hours you want this guy to work. So it could be as easy as that. But of course, you can just override this every time. It's not a problem. So this is one of the scenarios. It's, if you know the activities, you can preset them here and then just track as the actuals are invoiced and the actual cost is accumulated. And this will happen in a different video. Now, there is the other scenario that we mentioned, and that's if you don't want to spend this time pre-allocating the costs and expenses right now, and you want to just show them appear, kind of. So it kind of splits into two scenarios again. One option is you can do the same thing we did here and just create your budget and then wait for the actual accumulation to happen. So this will more or less equate it to the first scenario. And then as new unexpected costs, which are, let's say, permissible by the contract, if it's time and material, as they happen, you will just add them. And so you will see both your actual cost and budget cost increase at the same time. So that's perfectly okay. And same for billable and actual invoiced. But what you can also do is you can basically say that at the moment you're registering the expense. So this will be second scenario. Instead of pre-creating those planning lines, at the moment you're registering the expense from the job journals, there is an option which asks you, do you want to add these as planning lines? And you can actually do that. And we're not going to do it right now. I just want to mention it to explain the two scenarios. But that is a scenario that works as well. And if you're using this approach, you're basically not pre-building the planning lines as the project starts, but you're rather seeing them build up as the actual expenses are happening, as the actual revenue is going to occur. Then you can actually save a little bit on entering the job lines. And whether you go in the job journals and you post and then you tell the system to create these lines here, or you use the other way around, you can actually come over here, create these lines. And the more curious of you might have noticed this option here, quantity to transfer to journal. It essentially allows you to say, okay, this all time that I entered right now, or you can actually override this and say, no, actually I entered 20 for the budget, but I want to immediately post just 5 of these. That's okay. And just one here and one here. And for all of these lines, you can click process and then you can say create job journal lines. This is going to create the job journal, which will let you post and actually move this to actual. So we're not going to do it right now, but just so you know, at the moment of setting the project, you have those options, and these planning lines can be created and then be the source for the job journals, and they can also be created as the result of posting the job journals. And there is a third option, but I'm going to mention it in a different video once we start talking about invoicing and finishing the project. So I think this is already a pretty long video, and there's a lot of other topics we're going to have to cover, but considering this is normally a 2-day course, I think that's okay for a starter. So this was just setting up initially the project and being prepared to start tracking expenses and revenue as they occur. In the next video, we're going to focus on actually registering the expenses. We're going to link back again to the timesheet approvals. If you're curious, you can go and check the other video. Again, link will be in the description. It also already explains how to create a fresh resource and how to set it up for using timesheets and how to approve and post the timesheets. So we actually do cover a little bit of the job journal there. And in the next video, we're going to check how we can actually recognize the time spent by resources without using the timesheets, which is also a nice option. And that's where we're going to start filling in those nice columns about the actual costs and the actual. We're going to start creating invoices, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you want to make sure you don't want to miss the next episode, then again, hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell so you get notified, and spread the news. Like the more people learn about this, I really encourage you guys to leave me feedback in the channel under the videos. There's several things I'm looking for. One is what are the next topics you would most like to see. I have my own ideas, but I'm willing to try and mold them a little bit over what's the popular demand. And also if there are some clarifications, because I'm trying to go as deep as possible, but then also limiting the length of the videos. So which is why there are so many of them for essentially the same topic. But if there's something which you feel like I skipped over too quickly and you want more details, then feel free to drop a comment. I might include it in one of the next videos. If, however, you actually do want to reach out and get a personal consultation or have specific questions and you want a specific use case that you have to be investigated, then you can reach out again through a comment or send me a message. I'll put my email somewhere here in the video. And I'll put also contacts for the company that I work with, since I'm not a separate entity. I'm actually part of a company which is called Intelligent Systems from Bulgaria. Hi to the IS team. So if you would like to talk about this in detail and you want to look into some more specific scenarios and go beyond what's the standard out of the box functionality, then yeah, sure, feel free to reach out. We'll figure out a way to contact you. But that's it from me for now. Stay tuned for the next video on the VC training place.